had a secret Santa. We had a secret Santa party, so that's the present I got. Check this out.
What is that?
It's a Bottleship logo, which is half focused and half blurred.
Ooh.
I'm always complaining to the people that they blur things, so now they gave me half in focus and half blurred Bottleship logo.
Yeah, I can see that. So whose error was it? Whose error was it, Hristo?
Half of the life is in focus and half of the life is a bit blurry.
Hello, everyone. How are you? Welcome and thank you for being here today. I'm Cedar TW, Cebas Community Manager. So today we connect again to two different time zones. We have Hristo Velev of BottleshipVFX in Sofia, Bulgaria, Eastern Europe. And we have Edwin Braun, CEO of Cebas Visual Tech from Victoria, BC, Canada. Now, Hristo will be doing a show and tell about the China sci-fi movie Shanghai Fortress, the destruction scenes and breakdowns, hopefully more TP setups. So please understand that the work a studio does is copyrighted and archived away after release. So Hristo Velev can only show you what he still have in BottleshipVFX library. So,
can I interrupt for a second? Let me just interrupt for a second. So because Cedar and Edwin said that it's very important that there is some setups that we produce. So we are going to pull out of storage these couple of days after the webinar, and I think we have a few setups at least where we own all of the assets, and we can share this with you guys. So for a couple of these buildings that you're going to see falling, we are going to be uploading the full scenes.
Good, good.
Thanks everyone for joining this live stream. It's always nice to have live interactions with people, with users of our software or interested in our software. And the same for Hristo. It's always great to have him. They're doing right now amazing stuff, amazing visual effects. And I think his team is also growing. He will for sure tell us a little bit about himself and his company and how his team is doing. But what's really amazing, and I want to thank Hristo for that, that he is willing to share some scenes that he's allowed to share. So that's always the best, because that's how our community learns how to do things, and that's really amazing. And Hristo, it's your turn. Tell us all the secrets.
Thanks, Edwin. Thanks, Cedar. So yeah, thank you guys, everybody, for joining. It's awesome to be able to do this little of a show and tell, and it's awesome to have everybody on the stream, because we think the community is really important, and it's a pleasure for me to be showing you guys, because that's where I come in from the community. When I was learning this stuff for the first time, there were many people who were generous, and they were sharing their knowledge, and that's what I wanted to also do, to pass the torch to the next generation of cool people and to see what you guys can do. So I told you a little bit about that project and about our company. We are a team of about 20 people right now, and what we do is specialize in these heavy dynamics shows and things like, lots of destruction, water, explosions, fire, stuff like that. We're currently based in Sofia in Bulgaria. We are looking at expanding soon. Keep an eye on the news.
Do you see my float plane?
The plane is nice. You go to the city with the plane often, Edwin?
Every time. No, I'm not. But did you hear they had the first electric flight with a plane here in BC? Yes.
Sweet.
Yeah, electric plane.
This is a very difficult thing to pull off.
Yeah.
Heavy batteries. Okay, I'm gonna let the reel of the show play.
Yeah.
And just tell quickly about the show itself. It was a very ambitious project that was kind of being quite late. So the production didn't have too much time because they had stopped and restarted a few times. And the story generally is that the humankind has gone up in space and has discovered a great, interesting power source, and it's in the form of these crystals, magenta-colored crystals. And when they go, they bring it back to Earth, and it's a really great power source. But to power your entire city with that, you put it underneath in a cave, and eventually it gives you a lot of power, but it eats up the Earth underneath the city. So all the ground underneath the city becomes hollowed out and filled up with this crystal. And then eventually the aliens come back to retrieve the crystals, and basically they want to rip the city up. The city is up so they can get all the crystals. And the people in the cities fail one by one until only Shanghai is left. And they have two options. So first is to use the energy of the crystal to make a shield. But eventually this fails, and then they funnel all the energy to a cannon that they aim at the alien mothership, and they eventually blow it up but this is causing all the crystals that were underneath the city to turn to dust because all their energy is extracted, and the city collapses into the caves that have been now emptied underneath the city. So that's kind of the drama that unfolds.
Yeah, but we should have warned our viewers for spoiler alerts. Yeah, I thought the aliens win, and now, oh, this is so sad.
Yeah, maybe on the next one. Maybe
Yeah.
It's a good idea.
Okay, that's good.
And it would be cool to tell you a little bit about this show. So what you're seeing right now is our whole reel for the for the whole show. I'm starting off with the scenes early on in the progression of the drama. So everything starts with only cracking of the ground before, like, as the events ramp up slowly. And on these early shots, we mostly did stuff in comp. We painted some cracks in Nuke and then came up with a way to animate, expand them. I'm going to be focusing on the TP stuff here because of our host. So on the rest of the stuff, I'm just going to mention, so there is a little bit of a context, but I'm not going to dwell on it too much. And on this shot, we couldn't really solve it with just let me see if I can pull up its breakdown. We couldn't really solve it with just 2D, so we had to do a little bit of simulation work. I don't think I have breakdown for this in here, but anyway.
So, but you had to do some camera tracking, right?
Yeah, because the camera moves in here a little bit. So we did do some tracking, and eventually we replaced the entire ground in here because usually the client has shot a plate that they like a lot, but then they want it to interact with something which is very which does stuff which are quite specific. So eventually we can't really make things work with only the stuff that is in there in the plate. So we have to replace things, and we learn with the time that actually it's easier to kind of cut out only the characters maybe, and then just make everything else in CG. And in this one, we made the ground with CG. So the entire ground that you can see is being replaced because it's just much easier. And to make it interact with make it do whatever you want it to do. And this is a very simple version of a groundbreaking setup because we only wanted the tiles to crack a little bit since it's only the beginning of the movie. And we have painted a line that we slid a point across, and from the point we shoot particles to the sides, and we use this with a P-search to activate particles that are neighboring that, and we scale down these particles and rotate them slightly based on the distance to that center. so we can have crack. And this is quite efficient. But in the middle, it's not really helping out because we want some extra action to happen. So these particles in the middle, we push them down with a big piece that's kind of going on top, like some big foot, which is stepping on them, and another piece which is doing the same thing but from the bottom. So they hit here and there, and you can see some of the pieces that are breaking, which are going through a volume break and into bullet. So this kind of simple, but worked really well for this shot, which didn't have an FX bug actually, which is kind of interesting. So eventually we progressed to the much heavier stuff. Then in this shot, we start to see more of the city getting destroyed. And maybe if it would be better if I run breakdowns instead.
So that was also a full CG shot. Ah, okay. Now we see what's the plate.
So this had a plate. Yeah, you can
Okay.
see here in the beginning how much of this was plate.
Mhm.
So this had a plate, and the client said, okay, the plate is good, but we want to make the city battle scarred, and we want to have some extra buildings because this is the city as it is in a couple of decades maybe in the future. So we want some buildings that are a bit higher and a bit closer. And we had to create a few of these. So in this project, I think all of the assets, all of the buildings were created by us. There was supposed to be much more of the buildings that were that came from LiDAR scans, but eventually we used these as a reference for our builds because the buildings that you use for FX are not the same that you can just pick up from a LiDAR scan, or you can buy from a modeling site. Usually people model things that look okay from the outside, but once you start playing with them and fragmenting them and so on, they don't really hold up. They don't have an interior. They are not well built. The geometry is not well split inside. They don't have thickness where you want them. Eventually, we build more and more of our own assets. And in this one, we did that, and we also had a lot of simulations that we had made in place of smokestacks that we rendered with red, green, and blue lights in the three major directions, one from the left, one from the right, one from the back. And then we send these to the comp guys who can place them on cards in Nuke and use these colors to first turn all of them green, then gray, then add them together and just grade each individual of these gray components to create a lighting, which is more on the left, more on the right, more on the back.
Okay.
And this is much better than using the stock smokes that you can buy, but they are just gray colored and you can't control the lighting of. So yeah, we ended up with our own cards.
So how much time did you have for this shot? Was that a time critical thing, or how long did it take? Do you remember?
I think most of these shots, besides the crack shots, ran for the whole duration of the project, which is like between 3 and 4 months. This shot was one of the ones that we didn't really put a lot of resources on, and it's usually in the project is like most of this, like a shot that has this kind of complexity, this is a medium complexity shot. Even these shots run for a long time, and they are kind of on the slow burn for a lot of that time, because the rest of the shots which sets the tone, they change, and then you come back to this shot which you think, okay, we're kind of done with this shot, right? But on the other shots you say, okay, we want more of the city to feel smoked up and burned out and stuff like that. So the tone changes. So you have to actually come back to this shot and change this one also. So it's difficult because of that to say how long it took, because it was in production for 3 months, but the man days that we spent were not that many. People didn't work on this one as much as on the other ones.
Okay.
And yeah, it's a little bit more complex like that.
Okay, on the building design, you modeled the buildings, you said. because they are not looking like sci-fi buildings. They look like they would actually be real buildings in that's Shanghai, right? That, or should be future Shanghai.
Because
so did you
the idea
come up with the design, or who said the building should look like that?
We don't really come up with a design. So we propose designs,
Okay.
and then the clients are pushing us in some direction.
Okay.
And our design work is basically to create options, and then when the client picks, we move in this direction. And the design of the buildings was like that because when we proposed these much shinier buildings that had screens and stuff on them, the client said that actually the city has been suffering from this prolonged conflict, and it should look scarred and damaged and dramatic rather than sci-fi Blade Runner style advertising and so on. Basically, power is out in the city largely at this point, so you don't have screens and flashing lights and stuff like that. Fabian asks, is that film 5? Yeah, it is. And a small bit, I think, there is a small bit in the corner, in the lower left corner, which is Eddie, when we tried Eddie for a while. These guys here on this building. So yeah, Eddie is interesting because you can do stuff like this in Nuke, which is kind of faster. Vlad is also in here. So Vladimir, who just joined in, he has made a lot of the cooler stuff that we are coming up now to. So say hi. And Adrian, when he says, how do we make the buildings? The buildings, it's a kind of a straightforward process to make, because the buildings in this project were not close up. We had the challenge was to come up with a lot of them, but they were not close up, so we could spare the details. And I think the only special thing is that we have a code in our internal wiki outlining how to make the buildings. So you have some talks with the modeling people, and you then put this in the wiki, how to name your stuff, how to make the materials structure, how to have the thickness, and how to split up your objects. So each properly sized pieces are in the same geometry. So there is not geometry which is too big, for example, which is creating problems for dynamics, stuff like that. This is kind of the and then Nelson, for the destruction, I'm gonna go into more details in the next shots because they are more interesting. Okay, so then we come up to shots which are like this. This is kind of the next level of events. So there is more smoke here, but not much destruction yet. On a shot like that one. Sorry, I think this is wrongly named. But anyways, yeah, on these kind of shots like this one, there is just a little bit more destruction, but still in the early stages. We were mostly swinging the buildings around rather than breaking them, and you can see now mostly on the left side the World Financial Center that we had to play with. And I think there is basically two fun components. One of them is the cleaners swing in here, which is TP with the bullet ropes. So what we did was I think one of our guys made the model of that swing. So this is the thing that people climb on to clean the windows of. And we thought, okay, we need something interesting in there to create some action, because otherwise the building was feeling kind of static, and we don't want to sway it too much because we do this on all the other buildings anyway. And here we have an opportunity to get something more interesting going on. So we rigged up with the bullet rope, which we nailed to the top side and nailed to the bottom side with the two bullet particles that we attached to these pieces. And then one of them we broke off. I think just broke it off at a random frame, and this created this swinging motion because it's only hanging on one side. So this is kind of nice. And the other ththing is the breaking of this machinery here that falls onto the glass walkway. And we just said, okay, this is asking for some destruction here, but we had to make it not big since the client says, okay, this is still early on in the events. So we just pushed up a piece of machinery that we have down through the glass, and yeah, that's basically it. So still early in the process. So next we come to this shot, which is something which bridges us to the more advanced stages of the destruction. So in here we have the ground is falling through, some of the areas where there is water, the ground has already collapsed and the water is going down in the hole. There is much more building destruction on the lower left side. So, and at the later end of the shot, the idea was to see that, you know, later in the shot, to basically paint the progression of the event. That early on things that happening are less, later on things are more. We can see the cannon that the guys are going to shoot the aliens with. And on this one, we again wanted to preserve more of the plate, but eventually had to replace most of that because you can see, I think, over here, this is, I think, well, everything that we could preserve was the stuff which is not printed out in here. And even on these areas, we just added extra buildings. Because all of the stuff that has to interact to fall down, you can't really have this happening with the plate. So just get rid of all of this, replace with CG buildings, and especially the guys here on the on this close side. These were really good for having some destruction happening on them. These guys also, so we just placed a new building entirely, which is not there in the city at all. Sometimes we wondered, should we recreate the original building in the city and break this one and paint it out from the plate? So sometimes we did that, and sometimes we just added a completely new building. So this one is added completely new, and this one is replaced from the plate, these two guys. Okay, so then after that, the bigger shots start. So this is, Tom says that Kit Bash has a Shanghai kit, and we use that, yeah. We use that for some of the, I think we eventually use this as a reference, but it still helps out a lot because it gives you the proportions and the general shape of the building. So we can, even if we don't use that geometry in a movie, it helps that we can model very quickly being guided from this geometry. So yeah, it helps. So this is that shot. This is a building which actually exists. So we modeled the exact same building which is there in the real city, and that's our final shot. The breakdown is here. Let me find it. So this is showing the different stages of, not different stages, but different components. And I have a video which is going into much more detail that Vodi has prepared to show us how the thought process progressed. But here you can see first some of the damage that we painted to the city. Then you can see the original model that we had of the building intact. So this is the building from the photography, from the drone photography. Then this is the building already shuttered that we had built. So it's quite close. Then you can see the layers of secondaries and the layers of dust and smoke that we added and extra flashing lights and stuff like that. So to show you the thought process here, I think I have this video. So here Vlad is showing us how he went in creating this shot. So as pretty much always we do with these things, this is a guided simulation setup. So you can see these are later versions where there is smoke, but you can see in these guys that there is a kind of an outline cage of the building which is just built by these cubes which are not touching. So a lot of times I think it's obviously not the first time that I have been telling this, but this is just the best way to break a building. So that's what we use. So a lot of times people, when they're starting, they just start with the render geometry and they start simulating with that. And you see people who are starting up, they kind of always do that, which because it's the most straightforward, obvious thing to do. But this is actually not the best idea, because these simulating with the render geometry itself first is very slow. People tend to make these geometries detailed, obviously, because they need to look quite great. But this is not very good for simulation. So this makes your geometries very slow. Second, rigid body solvers that we use for doing these kind of things, they don't like things moving too much against each other, inside each other. They don't collapse very well. So to solve all of these problems, to make the whole thing faster and to make it collapse well and be easy to direct, we have a different geometry for simulation instead. So if you look here on the top right side, you're going to see that we have just built something which actually simple in this case. There is a cube which is representing a box which is representing the underside of the building, and all the edges of this box are these tiny cubes. So we don't here have the roof, because the roof is a separate thing, separate simulation, because it is close to the camera and needs extra detail. But with these tiny cubes, we have a simulation which is quite fast to start with. It's quite easy to direct, and they do not touch, and which makes them viable. They can move much more against each other. So if we ask them to break off all of their joints that they have in between them, they can sink into each other much more easily, which is much more resemblant of the crushing and collapsing that a real structure has. And you see here the pink stuff which is cutting through. So all the black cubes that you can see here, these are jointed together. So this is just a P-search and some bullet joints that are built between each particle and the neighbors. And whenever these pink particles, these magenta particles show, these are particles that are in a P-search around them that that cut the joints. So when this happens, these particles here, you see that they turn white and all of their joints break. So this creates a structural weakness into the construction. So because we can artistically decide where these structural weaknesses happen, then we can decide which pieces break off, and not in an obvious rough manner, but in a very steady, slow manner. So we can say that not all of the joints break, for example, and you can see here in this event that had happened, that not all of the joints had broken. So on the one side, the piece broke off, but on the other side, it kind of held. So this is how things end up looking nice. You know, you shouldn't just cripple everything, collapse it into a house of cards. It should be slow, and pieces should remain for a long time, and stuff like that. And once you have this basic simulation, then what Nelson asked was, you know, how do you transfer this simulation onto the high resolution geometry? And you can do a P-search in the beginning when the simulation is still in its state, which is not moving yet. And each of the pieces from the render geometry is finding a piece from the simulation geometry, and then it's getting P-attached to that. But eventually, when an event happens, in our case, when the velocity goes a little bit too high, or just with some kind of a random condition over time, when the particle is jointed, when the group of the guiding particle changes into the white group, for example, we release the piece from the render geometry from being guided, and it goes on into another group which has another bullet or SC node, and it falls down freely. So it can become this running down shattered fragments, which are not guided anymore. Because if you can see here, for example, the detail in the guide sim at the broken areas is not too much. So there you need to release some of the particles, or most of them, so they can go into, they can roll around and they can do their own rigid body dynamics. So you can get extra detail, and you can see this especially here. So these particles have left the guided sim, and we can get the shape of the guided sim still. But because there's some pieces that have already left the guided sim, and they are doing their own dynamics, and they are rolling down on their own, they're not being moved by the low resolution simulation, they add the high frequency detail. So this is the critical thing in building up these things. You need the guided sim for the big shapes, and the release from the guided sim for the small shapes. You need both of these to have detail. Otherwise, it doesn't really work. Okay, then, yeah, here some of the dust is in a bit of an early stage. We had challenges making all the smoke collide with the alembics and so on, but you know, stuff that usually happens in production. Most of it is problem solved. The next one was this guy here. So this is where we put all of these things that we have kind of built up from the previous shot, and these ideas, kind of the same ideas, but we said, okay, on this other shot, we went through kind of more meticulous, more focused planning and execution. But on this shot, we need to do something else. We have dozens of these buildings falling down, so we need to first make good looking shapes. Oh, sorry, Cedar, I wanted to pause a little bit to see if somebody has more questions. Before we move on to this part, but we can just rock and roll, and then.
Yeah, I think we're fine, unless someone comes up with a question now. But
okay, let's just.
I think your explanation of using the cubes as a rough shape to get the simulation fast should be pretty clear to everyone.
Yeah, this is gonna be in the scenes that we're gonna share with you guys as a holiday gift.
Amazing, that's good. Christmas, early Christmas, yay!
Yeah.
Just in time for Christmas.
Yeah, Santa Hristo.
That's good. So Vladi has also prepared a video for this one to show us how the whole thing progressed. And that's obviously starting here very simple with the cubes are being very loosely scattered. And then here we are exploring ways of making different shapes. And we said, okay, we can use the same ideas, but we have to make stuff which looks more interesting. And we started exploring to see how we can make interesting shapes. And we figured out several of these. So either you have the building which is getting torn by an influence on the outside. You're getting a building which is being eroded from underneath, or you get a building which is doing one of these things and hitting a neighboring building. So we kind of further figured out that two buildings hitting each other is one of the best looking things that we could do. So I said, okay, let's just experiment to see how far can we go with this. And here, because there are so many buildings in this shot, we just treated them in islands. And you can see how we start with a very simple geometry, and then we have some, we go with some ideas that test how we can have guides which are fragmenting on the insides. And then these ideas progress, and we add more and more buildings to the setup. These are usually simulated separately. This building is simulated separately because they don't interact. So the building on this side and the guys on this side, I think these are 1, 2, 3, 4 or 5 different setups, and we only simulate together the ones that collide. So this guy and this guy simulate together, but not together with the rest, which are not colliding. And another shape that we found that looks really interesting is the building that the Earth moves underneath of, and one side moves to the left, and the other side moves to the right. So the building eventually kind of unzips. So we thought this is quite fun.
Yeah,
So
that
this
looks
is quite
amazing.
fun. So, yeah, it's a fun choreography for sure.
That's amazing. Great shot.
So this was very nice that because the client let us design as much with this as we liked. So this was quite fun to do. And we said, okay, unzipping is very fun, but this top side feels kind of a bit too predictable. The line is too straight. So we said, okay, let's unzip it to the half height, and then let's collapse the top half. And that's what we have done here. So we unzip it first, and then we collapse.
Nice. Yeah, perfect.
So yeah, this is basically here the thought process, and all of these buildings have glass, like this one here. Not all of them, but a lot of them do. And for the glass, it's a secondary simulation that is following the stuff with the boxes that you just saw. These guys here. And based on some velocity or proximity with another bunch of particles that are maybe on the top of the next building that smashes through, they get released into the second bullet simulation that we spoke of, and we give them an extra punch, velocity along the normals, so they explode. Glass is fun when it explodes a little bit. So otherwise, quite similar to the setup that we showed in the previous shot. So good time for questions.
Yes, there are a few.
Fabian says, do we pre-cut the geometry? So actually, these days, it's nice to volume break, and then what we do is volume break, then noise, shape noise, and then stuff on the pieces on the edges. And the cool thing about this is that first you can have your simulation running quickly, and then you can make the 3D department help out a lot in detailing these shots, because it's not just FX people that have to work. The 3D guys, it's good to get them involved because they want to help out, and then they also see everything assembled, and sometimes they see problems where the FX people don't see them. So if you give them a lot of points on the edges of the fragmented pieces, and tell them, okay, guys, you can put some geometry on these points, they can use either the Frost instancer or in TP the geometry instancer to just put rebar and small stuff on these points, and then they can say, okay, maybe this is smaller, this is bigger, and they can cover up all of these areas where they feel that there are problems. So this making shots actually go a bit faster because FX people are more engaged with the actual motion of things, and not fixing issues that much. And fixing issues is left for when you render and you see, okay, this is a problematic area, then you just add some geometry in there and you cover it up. Yaku is saying the glass sim doesn't need to be directly linked to the building. The Windows is a separate sim. It's linked. I mean, I think it does need to be linked to the base simulation, just because it doesn't explode from the beginning. So for the first part of its motion, they are following the base simulation, and then when something happens, then they explode or they shatter, and that's why they need to follow. Like otherwise, if you don't carry them, then they would just stand where they originally were. So yeah, they need to be connected. Okay. I think that's what I'm seeing as questions so
Yep.
far. So let's move to the next parts.
So there were no people in the building, right? I didn't see any characters.
Yeah, the buildings are already deserted. So I'm just going through these files, but I think these are things that we've already gone through. And eventually we come up to, I think, this guy. Let's see where the full shot is. So for this guy, that's kind of the climax of the movie. So that's when the, sorry spoilers, that's when the big energy beam has hit the alien ship. It is exploding, and it's a 500 frame shot, which is huge, and it transitions between the initial state of the city that illuminated by the explosion, by this crazy God rays, then to the kind of night feel, which is everything is collapsed. It has collapsed into the darkness, but you get the moonlit phase, and all the way to being kind of wiped out at the end, which here I think we can't really see. So this has been a monster of a shot. Let me play the breakdown. And it underwent a lot of design iterations because it wasn't really clear how exactly would this happen. We had to do things which were not really consistent with each other. The ending was quite problematic because originally the director wanted something to come all the way from the explosion to the to the camera and make the camera sink into the smoke. But it's very boring to look at something approaching in a straight line towards you for 500 frames. Then the reference was, the idea was that we do something like a nuclear explosion, but then when you see it, an actual nuclear explosion, it is rising upwards, and here we have the thing that we explode is already at the top of the frame, so it has to go into a different direction, which feels somewhat unnatural. And there was a bunch of these, issues like that. On top of that, everything was absolutely heavy. So the geometry that you can see here of the city, pretty much, I think, only a few buildings at the front are remaining of the plate. Everything else is completely CG, and there is a kind of a DMP kind of thing at the background. So we had to replace everything else. And the challenge of keeping the shot interesting for 500 frames was, I think, the biggest one, because you can't have just one thing happening. We had to build these different types of events and different stages just to have stuff, interesting things to be looking at the shot during the shot. And because we were quite overloaded with the rest of the stuff, I think I missed part with this shot, which also had a fair share of aftermath of destruction. I think not as much as the previous guys, but there is some here and there. And we did not have much bandwidth to do a lot of rigid bodies into this one. So we emphasized on the volumes, actually. The idea was that by this time, most of the destruction and so on is gonna already have happened. And we had to really we wanted to really focus on the main event, which was the explosion of the alien ship. So to design that, you can see in here that we had to be clever with resolutions and with how we slice the whole thing up. So eventually, what we built was a single simulation, which was moving into kind of a corridor, an expanding maybe corridor, and we we made a star topology with this sim. So we put a lot of copies and rotate them and offset them slightly from a single center. So eventually get something like a hedgehog, which has a lot of simulations, going to the sides like the fingers of your hand. And this enables us to put all of the detail that we can simulate in one single sector of this explosion and multiply it several times to be able to cover a lot of the frame and maximize the detail. And when you see the part that we have there on the, that you can see the back side, so yeah, you can see that we only have this kind of stuff on the foreground. The background is empty. And we really liked these rings from the reference, from a nuclear explosion reference. So we built separate simulations for these rings. And some of the thinner rings were not even simulated. I think they were just volumes. We had, like you can see here, so many other smoke simulations that we just added on top of the city. And to do these, guys, we have a thinkingParticles source that we use some turbulent pattern or some collision to emit. Sometimes we have something which is a little bit high, and then we emit it downwards, and we noise up the ground. So when it hits the ground, it starts moving upwards, and because the ground is noised up a little bit, and because the velocities of the particles are also noisy, this creates some shapes. And basically that's the recipes that you need to have velocities and collisions to get interesting shapes. So we do a bunch of these, and we place them around the city. Some of these were colliding with the buildings, some were not. There is an element near the start which is creating our scorch. The heat which is coming from the explosion is scorching the buildings, so they get some kind of a smoky, like you see here, halo.
Very nice. That's amazing. That looks really good.
Yeah, lots and lots and lots of simulations in the foreground, in the midground, in the background, lots of geometry. This was taking 1 week to render this main explosion. So we only had a full render in the last, I think, week or last 2 weeks before delivery, because before that we only had like every 10th frame rendered, just because it is so heavy to render and it's moving slowly. So most people didn't see it in full until the last couple of weeks. But yeah, that's what it takes. It's a huge build.
So Hristo, the explosion type or the design or how it looks like, did your team come up with it, or was it a concept art first and they already had the idea of this smoke ball in the rings?
They did not. There was just the idea that there is something that the enemy spaceship is exploding, and then they said, okay, the explosion is really huge, and eventually it envelops the camera. But as I was saying in the beginning, that's kind of something that is simple to say, but when you start making it, it doesn't work. Yeah. So unfortunately, the client, usually in our movies, the client is letting us design a lot. So they eventually pick up what they want to be, which kind of option they want for the movie. But we come up with a lot of design iterations and ideas, and we implement usually not a single design for these specialty shots. Usually we go through a few of these designs, especially in difficult designs. But it's a really cool part. I'm not sure how it is in many of the other companies, but it's really cool for us that the client is letting us design things.
Yeah, so that's amazing. I tell you, that's the best mothership explosion I've seen, because usually when you see Hollywood style, it's just a gasoline flames, yellowish black smoke gasoline explosion for spaceships, which I always wonder how should that be possible. So this nuclear type explosion is amazing. I love it. And there's no gasoline flames to see, all these Hollywood type of explosion. This is amazing. I love the rings as they come out. I love the interaction with the other buildings on the ground. And holy moly, the amount of smoke I see there. Wow, you must have a huge render farmer. You must have been sweating getting this shot done. It's amazing. That's really an amazing job your team and you did there. I love it. I really love it. I love the rings and the nuclear type of look you got there. Amazing. It's really an amazing shot. So I'm pretty sure your client loved you for that. That is outstanding effects I see there. This is really nice design.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, we have about 60 machines on the farm, so not too many. We kind of punch above our weight. Usually, these kind of effects are being done by much bigger teams than ours. But yeah, eventually it ends up looking good. So, you know, hard work that pays off.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Something interesting, if I have to say a couple of more interesting things here, the way that the rings worked, the rays worked. This is like, you know, rays are a little bit controversial. Did we push it a little bit too far? We still talk about it if this went too far. But we felt like we need to paint a little bit more with the light in here. And the client's style was fitting it because, you know, they wanted things which are grandiose and which are, you know, a little bit on the edge of this world, a little bit dreamy. So we said, okay, let's try what we can do to paint with light and make it maybe so in the beginning it moves faster and then it moves slower. But the challenge is to enable the compositing team to control this thing because it's difficult to layer these volumes in a way which is comp friendly. So what we made is that these 3 volumes that you can see here, all as gray volumes, you can see that in this part of the breakdown they layer. So what we did is that we made them 3 different colors, red, green, blue. And when we rendered them together, then the comp people could split off each of these components. So they could then control the density and how much they add of these things separately. And to get the shadows from the explosion onto these volumes, it would have been way too heavy to render them together. So what we did was to project the explosion on a geometry ball that you can see in here, this black and white thing. So when we projected the render, we could use the bright and the dark areas for opacity maps and have a light inside which can shine through the white areas that, like you can see here, and not shine through the dark areas, so we get all of these crazy volumetric shadows. And the explosion itself, you can see how much different lights get added up here. And we knew that we will need heavy control of the lighting because it's such a complex thing, and it looks well in one place, then you change the lighting a little bit, so then another place starts looking good, but this part doesn't look that good, and this thing takes a week to push through the farm. So we actually rendered a lot of separate lighting elements that were, again, these red, green, and blue lights. And there were like, I think 4 or 5 of these renders because there were that many light groups. And eventually in comp, people could dial these light groups strengths and colors over time to get these changing looks, because like you can see, the look of the thing changes dramatically from the beginning, where you have this super bright ball, then here where you have the rim lit thing, then to here where you have kind of a night lit smoke. So these are completely different light setups that we have rendered separately, and then comp people are mixing them up together. So this is the only way to get like quick lighting control on this huge volume.
Yeah, we have a question. Adrian asks if this was just a plain mapping on the sphere where you directed the shadows for the
Yeah,
workers?
it was a projection. So the plane from the image plane was projected on the sphere using the sphere's UVs.
Okay.
So yeah, that was quite simple, but really great idea that one of our guys came up with. Let me see what other questions people have. How long it took to simulate? I think the simulation itself was not the heavy part because because of the hedgehog of grids that I explained that we did. So the individual simulation I think was about one night, which is usually our production simulations tends to be one night. Only when really necessary we push it to like one weekend simulations. But the point was that we put a lot of copies of this thing in this kind of a hedgehog configuration, so we can have one single simulation cover only small part of the frame, so we can focus the detail in there. Ansi would says camera is in the grid. Absolutely, what was in the grid. That last grid was such a pain. How to make this work, and we tried so many options and nothing looked good. So eventually, the thing that you saw, we came up in the last week with to have something which is, and it's still a little bit, you know, contrived maybe to behave like this, but this was what was solving it in the best way. How many different grids? I think it was about 12. So it was about 12 copies of that single simulation, which were layered in a way like that. You know, like we have 12 fingers, so I only have 10. Sorry, but basically the simulation is like this. You know, this is the center, and you have all the test simulations going to different sides. So as it progresses, they can overlap and create this ball, which otherwise, if you simulate one ball, you would never be able to get enough detail, unfortunately. Smoke rings. I think yeah, we have some. I have to think what was that, but I think they were not toruses. They were these flat cylinders that have TP particles on the cylinder, and we give them velocity with using the distance of the particle to the center of the cylinder, and the particles move outwards and they emit other particles to their left and right, which gain their velocity, and then as it moves, each of these particles is just spewing fuel and temperature, and this ignites, so we end up with this kind of rolling front. And the challenge there is that you don't want to see the emitter because the emitter doesn't look good. So always when you do these fluids, the closer you are to the emission point, the worse it looks. So what saved us there was that when we create the smoke, we always push it forward. So the emitter is expanding, but the smoke that you have emitted on the previous frames, you have pushed it forward so it covers the emission points. And this way you don't end up seeing the emission points. You only see the smoke that you have emitted a while back and you have pushed forward. Otherwise, it looks always bad because the emitter itself, near the emitter, it doesn't really look nice. Were there storyboards by the clients? There were no storyboards by the clients. We made animatics actually in this case. And sorry, I don't have ones here. They look basic, but they are funny to look at. And they're quick to iterate on. And for these kind of shots, animatics are useful only to a point because after a point, there is only something that you can only go that far with an animatic. This thing is too complex to represent with geometry even. You know, you have the geometry there and it doesn't give you transparencies, doesn't give you the relationships of the detail, the small to big ones. I mean, it's useful only to a point. We have had animatics and actually nowadays people have been doing grease pencil. So in Blender they have the we do simple rigid body in TP, and then we render a gray shade. People put this over the comp in Nuke, so you get a slab comp, and they draw with grease pencil in Blender designs like, let's say, which direction the smoke is going to go and when is some explosion going to happen, stuff like that. And they render some kind of a bad cartoon, you can imagine, you know, South Park style or something like this. And these are great. So compositing people can do this. We have taught our compositing people a little bit of Blender. So in the beginning of the project, when they don't have as much work, they can do these kind of designs in motion. So this is quite cool. Let me see if there's any questions that I have missed. But yeah, the grease pencil animatics. This should end up in some kind of a version of the movie. These are fun to look at. They're bad, but they're hilarious. Tom is saying that the techniques are similar to the research joint setup for using cubes to destroy the buildings. Absolutely. I don't know about the exploding head from Alan. I'm looking at his videos, but kind of quickly, so I might have missed this one. Okay, so Taryn says, how are you handling the destruction geometries with the X-Mesh Alembic through VRA proxy? This is a really good question. So what we really wanted to do on this project is give the guys from lighting the same stuff that they give the guys from FX. So lighting person has come up with the design of the tower. It has he has given its materials assigned to all the polygons and stuff like this, and we wanted to give them an object like an Alembic or a VRA proxy that has the same materials assigned. Now that has a few more materials for the breaking pieces, and it is an object that they can place in their scene, that they can look the material of, change the material, and so on, which is treating it the same as any other object that they would have. So Edwin helped us a little bit there to augment the Alembic export process, and we added a couple of our own scripts. So when you export the Alembic, it is looking at the geometry that the TP particles originated from, and it's assigning the same materials. So eventually you have one Alembic object with the same materials assigned, and this is the thing that you publish for lighting. So you save your max file because you can't just send them the Alembic, because the Alembic doesn't hold the shader information. But you can save a max file which has the Alembic loader with the material assigned. Sorry. And then the people in the lighting, they actually merge this into their scene, and they have an object with the material assigned that they can do all of their normal lighting stuff with. So this was how the lighting workflow was on this one. And that's how I advise people to do that, because that's much better for lighting people than any other approach that we have tested. Let me see if there's anything else.
The fluid simulation. Did you see the question?
It's cool that Tom has lived one block away from where the stuff has from all the stuff. I would love to see this happen to my city. This would be so much fun. I can only imagine the fun, how it feels to look at that. Actually, there was a Bulgarian movie lately that there was some policemen and they get a call on their the walkie-talkie, the police, and they say on the street Samuel 22, some guy is threatening to set himself on fire. I said, shit, Samuel 22 is my street, in my address actually. So you see the cops that they drive down my street and then they walk out of the car in front of us, and they go into the neighboring building. But I said, damn it, I was there some day on the weekend, some when they shot that. But yeah, it's the movie happened on my street and my building. This was really cool.
So there was one more last question down there at the very end of the chat,
Okay. So
where they ask about the fluid sim.
Okay, so yeah, Rob is asking what is it for the river? Is it one sim or multiple sims? All the water here is Houdini, and we have one on the right side and one on the left side. And it was a total pain. The left side was a total pain because it doesn't make sense geometrically, and because you can see here the river is like this, and then the water has to go all the way into this kind of a hole in here. So we're not extremely happy with how this came up. It was our first kind of super colossal Houdini waterfall. So yeah, eventually I think we augmented a lot of this with some extra water that was just footage. But the right part came up a little bit better because it makes much more sense geometrically. So we could just push some water from the right side of the frame, which is much closer. So it doesn't have to travel such a huge distance, and it's interacting with the buildings. It's working much nicer. So yeah, this was easier to deal with. All of these dressing was scattered with TP, I think, or the 3D guys did it on the edges, and that's kind of how the water went. Okay. Yeah, I think that's basically what I had to show you guys. Let me see if I had missed something, but I think no. We have a turntable here of the many colored lights, so you can see the trippy way that it looks like. So the red is obviously the stuff on the back side, which is not here, but
yes, sir.
it's nice when you look it from the front.
Hey, what's up, Phil?
I was supposed to call you.
Yeah, some feedback showed up.
So you're back. I saw.
Okay. Can you see me? Can you hear me now?
Yeah. So,
okay, so yeah, this is an example of how these colored lights look. So you have the red, the green, and the blue, and you can then recolor them in comp.
yeah. So you said you used Nuke for comp, or?
Yeah, like all of the VFX facilities, comp is in Nuke.
So
pretty much.
And you would just encode the direction of the light in the RGB, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nowadays you can have nowadays with V-Ray, the guys helps out on that, and you can have the lights in separate frame buffers, so you don't have to override your color, because sometimes you need the color for something. And this is the RGB porn version of the shotting here. I think that's kind of an earlier version than what eventually ended up in the shot, but still you can see some of the stuff that was happening on all of these different buildings.
Yeah, that's a lot of destruction going on.
And that's many buildings, and we are, 4 people FX team, so you can imagine. We are quite productive. Okay, so that was basically it, guys. Hope you enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, Hristo.
Yeah, thanks for having me. If you have other questions, please ask. The next thing that we can show would be from a Bollywood movie called War, where we blew up a ship. So, which was something different. And yeah, I think we can show this quite soon.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. So thank you everyone for attending. Thank you especially to Hristo and Edwin for hosting this. And Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to everyone.
I wish the same to everyone. Have a nice Christmas. Thank you, Hristo, for that.
Yes,
and we're looking
so
forward
much.
for the scenes you can share. That's always appreciated.
Thank you, guys.